Why do athletes in swimming, baseball, and tennis typically develop bicipital tendinitis? Well, first, we need to understand how and why bicipital tendinitis starts. Also, stick to the end of the video to learn something that's not in your textbooks. Let's study bicipital tendinitis. Let's take a look at the anatomy first and foremost. So when thinking of the actions of the biceps, you have shoulder flexion, elbow flexion, and supination. When taking a look at bicipital tendinitis, it's the inflammation caused typically at the long head of the biceps from overuse. The action we're going to be looking at the most is that overhead or shoulder flexion movement. This repetitive movement will cause small little tears in the tendon, causing inflammation, irritation, and could even potentially lead to further complications. Remember those sports that we mentioned at the top of the video? So all of those have that repetitive overhead motion. Swimmers have it in the freestyle swim, baseball players have it when throwing and pitching, and tennis players when serving. You can even find this in several occupations such as mechanics or hairdressers. Activities that require prolonged biceps activation can typically lead to bicipital tendinitis. So let's say this patient arrives to your clinic. How will they present? Typically, patients with bicipital tendinitis will have that deep ache directly in front or on top of their shoulder. Activities such as lifting objects overhead, as this activates the biceps, may make their symptoms worse. Patients will typically find relief with rest. We're going to keep that in mind a little later when it comes to interventions. Patients with those longer-term bicipital tendinitis may experience those further complications I was mentioning earlier. Those complications are shoulder impingement syndrome, rotator cuff tendinitis, and other forms of glenohumeral instability. So now that we know what it is, how are we going to treat this patient? What goals do we have in mind? The primary goal should be relief of pain. So reducing their inflammation, regaining their full range of motion. There are no contraindications when it comes to bicipital tendinitis, but the patient should be avoiding activities that provokes those pains. This may mean no overhead reaching, no lifting heavy objects, or even potentially not participating in their sport for the time being. These are things that we also need to keep in mind when assigning their interventions and exercises. As we mentioned before, rest is typically what provides relief for patients, so active PT is not typically recommended in the acute stage. If a patient does come to you in that acute phase, we need to think about those feel-good interventions. So their goal is to reduce the inflammation and reduce the pain. Activities such as TENS, heat, cold, STM, iontophoresis, or phonophoresis are a good place to start. To provide further rest and cueing for the patient at the very least, a patient may be recommended a brace or a splint in order to remind them that they're not supposed to be using that arm. Once the patient leaves that acute phase, we want to start incorporating stretching and strengthening exercises. We want them to return to their regular activities and regain full available range of motion while reducing future injury. When coming up with these interventions, keep in mind what sport do they play? What activities do they have to do for work? This will help you guide you towards the interventions that you should be completing for the patient to be able to return to their main objective, I would say. On average, rehab will typically last 6 to 8 weeks. Once the goal is achieved, they may return to their regular activity, but keep in mind that their regular activity is probably what landed them here in the first place. So proper patient education and activity modification may be needed to reduce the reoccurrence rate of bicipital tendinitis. Let's quickly jump over to something that's not in your textbook. So specifically talking about, for example, baseball players. So when doing an activity like pitching, their external rotation for their pitching arm might not be the same as their non-pitching arm. A lot of the times that we are working towards getting both of their sides even, how much range of motion do you have on your left versus your right? When it comes to treating athletes that do these repetitive motions, that might not be the case. Make sure that they're able to participate in their sport with little to no pain, and also educate these patients on how to prevent future occurrences of bicipital tendinitis. Well, that's everything for bicipital tendinitis. Have you treated this before? Any tips to help study or remember bicipital tendinitis? Leave them all down in the comment section below. I would love to read them. We also have a podcast where we release episodes twice a week, so be sure to check that out, and our links in the description. And until then, we'll catch you next time. Take care.